because you have to make sure you don't make a mistake and allow the wrong rider to escape. At the finish of every stage of this race, there were small time bonuses, and Lisa's overall lead was still only 27 seconds. Amongst the riders who attacked were Darren Lawson of the Wyongshire team, and this was Schmidt of the Soviet Union. But the pace, as ever in these circuit races, was high, and the riders found it extremely difficult to stay out in front. It's a time for everybody to see top-class international cycle racing at close quarters and cheer the riders on. They offer money at the finishing line, the riders turn on the power and the style. At this stage, the riders had pedalled just over half of the 1,100 kilometres down to Darling Harbour, and there was still no sign of a dominant leader. 27 seconds, you know, is not a lot when gaps of 1 and 2 minutes can be opened up on the main roads. This wasn't the place to launch an attack. Thomas Lisa knew that barring accidents, he would retain his overall lead this night. He always rode with great observation, just near the front of the field. He watched everybody who launched an attack. He then evaluated if it was worth chasing them. And one rider he chose wasn't worth chasing was John Hughes, the British national champion. Hughes attacked 1.5 laps from the finish. This year John Hughes had had a tremendous season, basically in Europe, and indeed in France. And now he'd missed the World Championship because of a broken wrist. He was coming back to form in this sprint finish, winning the stage just as he had a year ago at the entrance in Wyongshire. And Thomas Lisa knew it hadn't affected his overall lead at all. The riders had now done 570 kilometres. We were at the halfway stage, and these were the overall situations. In the individual race, Thomas Lisa was leading Rick Reed of New Zealand by 27 seconds. Robert McLaughlin of the Australian Sport and Rec team was third, 1 minute 23 seconds back. Andrew Perks of Great Britain was fourth, Darren Smith was fifth, and Brett Dutton was having a great ride in sixth place. He was 1 minute 33 seconds down. In the other competitions, Jan Court was riding high. In the Commonwealth Bank Rollover Sprint King competition, he had 24 points. Darren Lawson was second here with 12, and John Leeswin of the United States, he was in third place with 8. Court was also leading in the Australian Telecom King of the Mountains competition. He'd scored 14 points. Sergei Smievskoy of the Russian Polaroid Sunglasses team was second with 8, and Thomas Lisa was riding high here as well. He was in third place with 7. In the Pacific Power Points Championship, Jan Courts was still on top too, 19 points scored. Thomas Lisa up into second place here with 8, and John Leeswin of the United States, he was third. In the Caltex Team Championship, it was a close thing. The New Zealand ASB Bank Air New Zealand team were leading, but the Australian Wyongshire team were having a great race. They were 25 seconds back, and that was really very close indeed. In third place was the United Kingdom Sutton Holden's team, and in fourth place, Poland were doing well for their sponsors Caltex. In fifth place, the Russian Polaroid team, and in sixth place, Australia's Hampshire Club Med squad. 70 riders were facing up to the final few days of this classic, which carried quite a few stings in the tail. And the riders now had to complete 173 kilometres from Foster down to Newcastle, and it was a tough one as well. There were still plenty of riders willing to test the powers of the Bosch team. Bosch had been one of the biggest supporters of the Commonwealth Bank Classic during his 10 years, but they'd never won the race, and they were anxious now to try and control everything. This stage got off to a cracking start. For the first 10 kilometres, the speed never went below 50 kilometres an hour, and the long, thin line meant pain for most of the race. The attacks were coming right at the very beginning. 2 riders who went out in front, literally to test the water, was Alexander Nadobenko and the Tour winner 2 years ago, Matthew Bazzano. At first they went out in front just to see what would happen. Then they suddenly found what happened was they were left alone in the lead. 3 riders began to chase: Jason Phillips, Dariusz Baranowski and Robert Balmer. But by then the lead was already a minute for these 2 leaders, Matthew Bazzano and Alexander Nadobenko. This is a lovely area of New South Wales as well. We were circling the lakes and across the lakes the leaders could see the chasing peloton. 173 kilometres this breakaway had formed after only 15 kilometres. At the back of the field, by the way, that was Peter Barnett, who was coming back after a chase which lasted 25 kilometres. Such had been the speed when he had the bad luck to puncture. These were the three chasers: Jason Phillips of the Wyongshire team at the back, Baranowski of the Caltex Polish team, and also here Robert Balmer of the New South Wales Sport and Rec. They got within 45 seconds of these two, and then they gradually started to fall back. Bazzano was riding strongly over the top of the climb at 47 kilometres, going over ahead of Nadobenko. The gap was now 2 minutes 53 seconds to these three, and Baranowski was trying to find out exactly how far to go. This was a great breakaway. Overall, Nadobenko was lying 22nd, 2 minutes 43 seconds off the leader's yellow jersey. Bazzano was 32nd, 6 minutes back, and at 55 kilometres, Nadobenko was sprinting best over the top of the climb. Bazzano was second. Baranowski was the man to come over that climb in third place as they headed down towards Bouladila. The gap was now 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and there's plenty of riders like Michael Heyman here asking exactly how far ahead are they. At one stage, the lead was up to more than 5 minutes. The three chasers had no chance. At the back of the race, Simeon Hempsel had problems of his own. He'd actually fallen back with a mechanical problem and had promptly been knocked off by the over-enthusiastic service team. He had to come back again and replace his bike. Note his bandaged elbow. That was the result of the first service. Into the feeding station, the riders were now beginning to get agitated. The helpers here had told them that this race could be going away from the Germans, because Nadobenko was now the overall leader on the road. The German Bosch team were in trouble. They also looked a little bit confused. They were finding few friends, and so now from the back of the race it was time for the yellow jersey to take control himself. Word had now reached the main field that the two leaders that went out front as a gamble now held 8 minutes and 30 seconds advantage. The chase had to start soon, and one of the riders who was taking up the chase was Bordolato of the Italian team. He'd realised the urgency of the attack, and he was now trying to do something about it. The main field were continuing to just ride, as they would call it, tempo, and hope that the two leaders, as they crossed the bridge here in Hexham, would slow down. The Bosch team had found themselves some strange allies in the British team and also in the Rocks team, but they'd found people willing to chase down. By the time that Matthew Bazzano and Alexander Nadobenko came onto the small finishing circuit in Newcastle, the gap was just 55 seconds. Neither were a candidate for the yellow jersey now. It was only a question of whether they would survive to take the stage honours they so richly deserved. They'd been in the lead now for almost 4 hours, and Matthew Bazzano's face told us that. He was now getting tired as they lapped here Michael Leahy of the Ansett team. Leahy had had the bad luck to puncture on the circuit, and the two leaders had seen him 1 lap ahead. Alexander Nadobenko at last scoring a first for the Soviet Union this year. They'd been quietly subdued, but now they were coming to top form, and Bazzano had no answer as Nadobenko sprinted clear for the stage victory. He was absolutely delighted. At last the Polaroid team had scored a first place. The gap, though, a shade under 30 seconds when the main field sprinted home. It had been a tough ride, a long gamble in the end for nothing, except a nice slice of Commonwealth Bank glory, and probably one of the longest breaks in the history of the race.
And in second place to Matthew Bazzano.
A welcome addition to the race this year was the additional sponsorship from the Electricity Commission of New South Wales, soon to be known as Pacific Power, and so the race made a deviation. It went inland into New South Wales for a tour of the power stations. Now, power stations are certainly not the most beautiful things to see. My goodness me, it's nice to know that this one at Bayswater, where the riders were rolling out, were planting 40,000 gum trees, and the hope for arrival of the koalas, that most cuddly of marsupials. But before the riders faced up to the 145 kilometres to Iraring Power Station, it was a tour of the cooling towers and a chance to look forward to to what was to come in the centre of New South Wales. The riders were in no hurry. The wind was still blowing. It had been a feature of this race. 12 months ago, the feature was the tailwind. This year, it was tail to cross, and it was creating many problems. The riders who were riding best at the front, though, appeared to be the Bosch team. They were always in control of the attacks. Again, a fast start, in excess this time with a tailwind of 55 kilometres an hour. In fact, at one stage, following cars were knocking up 85 kilometres an hour, and Lisa was making sure everybody in the race could see him for what he was, one of the strongest riders on the grid. But it wasn't all downhill, and soon the riders were slogging through the heart of New South Wales. There were 2 mountain climbs on this stage before the finish, and the finish itself was up a very sharp incline at Eraring power station. The Bosch team was seemingly in control. They had 3 riders on the front. The yellow jersey was further down the line, keeping an eye on people back there. This is the way top teams should handle themselves, but one rider they couldn't control was Brett Dutton. Brett Dutton was still a top 6 candidate in this race, and he attacks very early on. His attitude was just to see what he could get going. But unfortunately for Brett, he was left out there for a long time. When they came to Singleton and the first sprint at 34 kilometres, Dutton had been joined by Baranowski. They were just together in time for the sprint before Jan Koorts at the back was starting to head up the main field. Jan Koorts was still the leader in the Pacific Power points competition, and he was still finding it good to sprint with everybody else. They weren't fast enough though. Baranowski won here, Nadobenko was second, Jan Koorts was third, and Bardolato was fourth for Italy. During the first hour of racing, the Phill had averaged 47.7 kilometres an hour, and then they encountered one of the famous picker-plank bridges, and this one, with the gaps through the middle, was a little bit wide for those narrow racing wheels, and riders at the back took it with great caution. Then an attack by Bob Reisenberg. He normally manages to win at least one stage of a bank classic every year he comes here. Now he was searching for what had been so far an elusive victory. The Dutchman was out front, while riders at the back were coming to the rear of the peloton after punctures. The winds were blowing, and the race was now in the famous Hunter Valley wine area. There was no time, though, to admire the vineyards as they continued to race now, heading for the power station finish at Eraring. Baranowski, the Caltex rider for Poland, still the Polish were trying for a stage win, and still they weren't getting it. Baranowski, the young man who had won a medal in the Junior World Championships, was out front. The race was showing a lot of respect for this Polish rider. He'd perhaps made himself too obvious a candidate for victory. He'd been in the thick of the action all day. He'd won the special sprint at Singleton from that race with Brett Dutton, and now he'd gone clear again on the King of the Mountains at 87 kilometres covered. He was going over the front in first place, while further down on the climb was the unlucky Jan Koorts. He punctured, and he was not going to see the main field again. Koorts was now concentrating on the King of the Mountains and the Pacific Power points competition. His overall chances had gone on that long ride to Grafton. He was happy now to ride home, while Robert Crow was thinking more of the stage victory. Crow's Repco teammates were slowing down the field, hoping that the Australian champion would get a lead big enough to give him victory at the end of the stage. Well, Crow has perhaps the biggest legs in the business, and they're not built for climbing mountains. And as he ground his way up this climb, which was coming after some 100 kilometres covered, he was being pulled back by the top half of the field. Not quick enough, though, and Robert Crow was over the top at 118 kilometres in first place, ahead of Smieski, who was now building quite an interesting points total. He was closing in on Jan Koorts, and Koorts, remember, at this point, was behind the race, unable to score points. In third place there, the ever-vigilant Thomas Lisa. Soon after Crow was caught, the race split, and a leading group of 23 had formed. And then John Leeswin, the United States rider on the Pacific Power team, decided it was time to split this group up even more. In the far distance of the picture here, you might have caught sight of one rider from the Hampshire team. That was Patrick Jonker. He was almost on the back of this lead group, and Leeswin turned the screw that little bit tighter, and Jonker never made contact. Now the uphill finish towards the line at Zeraring Power Station, and John Leeswin had the gap. He'd been joined by one of the danger men of the race to Lisa, and that was Robert McLaughlin, lying in third place overall. So Lisa was obliged now to whip up the chase behind. McLaughlin had given his all to try and gain time over the yellow jersey, and John Leeswin took full advantage of that. When it came to the sprint, he won it easily. And what a great start for new sponsors in this race. Pacific Power had provided the sponsorship of the day and the sponsorship of the winner. It couldn't have been more perfect for John Leeswin of the United States.
The winner, John Leeswin of the United States of America.
As a result of that second place, McLaughlin held on to third place but closed the gap to just 68 seconds of Thomas Lisa. Then the riders were transported down to Toukley, the heart of Wyong Shire and part, of course, of the Tugler Lake system. This is a lovely town, and they put on a fine crowd and some great weather. If this race had taken place just an hour earlier, the riders would have been soaked in what was quite a storm. As it was, the roads were drying out, and the riders were putting on quite a show yet again. Wyong Shire is one of these forward-looking shires. They sponsor a team in the race, and so not surprisingly, they wanted their team to be seen at the front. Simon Lillystone here from the Sutton Holden's UK team had a puncture. He was second in this classic 2 years ago when he was last in Australia. He wasn't riding quite so well on this visit. He'd taken his allowed lap out, and he was now back in the race with no penalty applied. The storm had now abated, and the riders were able to get on with their racing. The crowds were giving $100 lap prizes to the riders who could stay out front and come back round under the finishing banner. Darren Lawson was riding for the Wyong Shire team, and he was out in front mopping up the dollars. While the Pelicans wondered what was going on, the field decided that Darren Lawson was not going to stay out front and win the stage. And very shortly, he was swept up. The field hunted him down. There was one other rider in this race who was anxious to impress and had said earlier he wanted to win the stage, and that was Mike Landsman, the former East German Olympic champion. It was his birthday today. He was 24 years of age, and it was time now to get out in front and show himself to the cameras. He was out in front with Patrick Jonker, the rider who a few hours earlier had finished totally dejected after making a mistake that almost certainly had cost him a high finish in this race. Jonker was now in 19th place overall, 4 minutes and 21 seconds behind Thomas Lisa. Landsman was not a threat, and so the two were making ground over the field. The Polish rider here was in fact 1 lap behind. He too had had a fateful puncture. So Lisa was quite happy to let the man he had feared most in this race at the beginning at Bond University come out in the big sprint and win the stage ahead of Landsman, spoiling for him his celebration birthday. Even so, second place isn't bad, is it? And then in the sprint for third place, Darren Smith for the Wyong Shire team, giving them a perfect day out as well. Smith is a name you do well to remember, because he was now starting to affect the result of this race. But for the moment at least, Jonker had now won 2 stages, and Landsman had finished second. Smith had finished third, and overall there was no change. And with the sunset forming, the riders were now free to spend the night in the new Beachcomber Resort in the centre of Toukley. It was back to Vales Point Power Station next morning, and the nearby Memorial Power Station was the finish of this 100 kilometre stage. But it was slow to start, in fact half an hour late to start, because an accident before the start had left John Leeswin with a wrecked bike. One of the car drivers had reversed his vehicle across the bicycle of John Leeswin, the United States winner of the previous day. He was now looking at broken frame, bent cranks, bent chain wheels and a pair of broken wheels, not to mention his computer had gone wrong as well. There was no sign of panic, and Leeswin and the mechanics were working overtime. In fact, when the field got underway, it was about 25 minutes late. And one thing about the Bank Classic is, it's rarely ever late. In fact, Marmora is only 7 kilometres away from Vales Point, but the way the riders were going, it was 100, and after 45 kilometres they would encounter Bumble Hill, a name given to the hill in recognition of the leader of one of the last surviving Aboriginal tribes here some years ago. This had to be the most nervous day so far for Thomas Lisa. He complained of an injured knee. He'd even said at one stage he would not finish the tour, but he was giving no indication of how that pain was on this morning. The riders were ready to find out. John Hughes, the British champion, was the first rider to attack. He did so after just 2 kilometres of racing. He was chased down by Matthew Bazzano. This was now a plan to stretch the Bosch team to their limit. By 7 kilometres, Hughes and Bazzano were together. The race was again in full cry, and the riders were now chasing gaps of their own, the gaps that were forming in the centre of the peloton. Matthew Bazzano, recovered from that long 4-hour breakaway on the road to Newcastle, had joined John Hughes. Hughes was now finding real good form. He'd won at Toukley, he was now on the attack again. But very shortly, he found he had a lot of people for company. The race continued to split and regroup. They were putting the pressure on the Bosch team. It was always the Bosch riders who were chasing down the breakaway. Then the riders were off into the beautiful Yarramalong Valley. They knew at the end you had to turn left, and when you did so, it was all uphill. The Soviets were a lot more active now. They'd steadily found their form. Lisa was suddenly finding there were a lot of riders now challenging for his yellow jersey. Along the valley road, again the field had reformed. It had split now on at least 4 occasions. Then the dreaded sign, Bumble Hill Road. You turn left and it's 4 kilometres straight uphill. The Bosch had made sure that their man in yellow had made the turn perfectly because the road is narrow. He was back in 3rd place. Other riders now knew they had to attack in the full sight of the yellow jersey, and they had to leave him on the slopes of Bumble Hill. Well, until this point, Thomas Lisa had said he'd not seen any real hills in New South Wales, just small climbs. But he'd never seen Bumble Hill either. 4 kilometres, and the Soviets were now in their element. They were stretching the field over 200 metres. Alexander Scheffer was now challenging at the front here. Gone from the front too was Jan Koorts, the leader in the King of the Mountains. There was a real danger now that the Soviet team could knock Koorts off the top and take his coveted leader's jersey. As the climb increased, so too did the strength of Darren Smith on the left of our picture, a Wyong Shire team man in the very heart of Wyong Shire. This was the showdown on Bumble Hill, and Justin Grindle was now managing to attack Alexander Scheffer, who was grimacing but holding on to his wheel. And not too far back either was the yellow jersey of Thomas Lisa. For the rest of the race, you could really see just how hard this climb was. It was a matter of grit your teeth and get to the top as best you can. Grindle now had to resist the challenge of Scheffer. He did it too. He held Scheffer, who found loose gravel on the inside, and then realised he was coming too late to get to the white line and the top of the mountain. Justin Grindle for the Repco team went over the top in 1st place. Alexander Scheffer was 2nd. The hill had done its damage, and now there was a leading group of 8 riders forming as they faced a 10-kilometre circuit before going back down Bumble Hill and heading back towards the finish in Marmora. The 2 riders noted who were missing from this group, and certainly the man who noted them was Thomas Lisa, was 2nd placed overall Rick Reed in this group here, and also 3rd placed overall Robert McLaughlin. They both formed in the 2nd group on the road. They had been agonisingly close to catching the yellow jersey at one stage, but they couldn't quite reach out and get on. And gradually now, this front group, which had built to 9 riders, was going clear of the rest of the classic. Then came the long descent with speeds attained of up to 80 kilometres an hour as the race returned down Bumble Hill and back along the Yarramalong Valley. Thomas Lisa had finally got away from the 2 riders he had feared most. He was now fearing, though, a new Australian rider in this race, Darren Smith. Smith had had 2 third places in the last 2 stages. He was now in this leading group. The New Zealand riders and McLaughlin in the 2nd group were slipping further and further away. Lisa was now driving this race. He knew what he had. He had the race in the bag, barring an accident. Even though he was concerned by the activities of Darren Smith, he found he couldn't shake him off, try what he would. Darren Smith was writing himself a place now on the Olympic development squad. Watch him on the far right here, as Lisa suddenly realises he can't match him in the sprint, and is he annoyed. Darren Smith was delighted, and so too was Mum, who flew down from Brisbane. When she arrived, she saw her son first across the line, the end of a perfect day out. The 19-year-old, first-year amateur rider from Surfers Paradise had now climbed up to second place overall, 56 seconds behind Thomas Lisa. And Robert McLaughlin, who slipped away from third place, he led home the next group in, over 4 minutes behind. So the last 2 days touring the power stations of New South Wales had made this race quite a different picture. They'd found also a new star, Darren Smith of Australia. And so to the final weekend, and the riders being transferred down into the centre of Sydney, perhaps the most fashionable capital in the world. Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House overshadowing the circuit around the rocks. A colourful atmosphere, plenty of people, and a grand finale for the final weekend of racing. Just this circuit race, followed by the main road down to Wollongong, and then back to Darling Harbour for the big finale tomorrow. The riders were still there, ready to turn on the style. Thomas Lisa now feeling a lot more satisfied with his week. He built up a lead of almost a minute over Darren Smith. The rest of the race knew they had no chance now. So not surprisingly, it was always the riders going out to take the stage victory. This was a very tricky little circuit. It was down through the old customs area, out round the back, a little bit of cobblestones, very sharp bends, and then a fast finish. It was a stage that was built for a man who would ride in circuit races most of his summer, Bob Rasenberg of Holland and the Websdale team. He enjoys circuit races at the best of times, but this time he was enjoying it better than most. At the back of the picture here, Rasenberg had gone out on the attack. He'd taken with him the Australian champion, Robert Crowe. Crowe knows the bike riders will follow, and Bob Rasenberg was in his element. They built a lead gradually over the field of 1 minute as the crowd enjoyed the spectacle. Crowe had had a knee problem for a fair bit of this race, but it seemed to be no problem now as he continued to lap the field with Bob Rasenberg. Thomas Lisa didn't fear either of them. Although Robert Crowe had been third in the opening time trial at Bond University, he'd lost far too much time on the open road down to the rocks. And then came the sight every criterium rider loves to see, the tail end of the field ahead. And Robert Crowe was rather anxious now to catch up. This was the big sprint. Crowe had got the advantage going into the very tight left-hand bend. At this point, Crowe had this stage won. But Bob Rasenberg, inspired as he always is by his visits to Australia, found the power he needed to take the race out. The Websdale rider now joins the top men with 4 wins in the years in this classic. Men like Glenn Clark, Barney St. George, Malcolm Elliott and Vladimir Galushko. And the Websdale team also took third place with Paul Barton, who beat Ian Gilks, pushing him to fourth, while in fifth place it was Jan Koort who managed the sprint there. A familiar sight on the winner's podium, Bob Rasenberg, as he salutes the crowd, and yet another great season for him. There was no danger, though, to the overall lead. Thomas Lisa now had 1 day to go in the Commonwealth Bank Cycle Classic. The road from Darling Harbour to Wollongong is a hilly one. It climbs all the way up to Mount Ousley, then it's a fast descent down to Wollongong itself, and 10 circuits of Flagstaff Hill. On the way out from Darling Harbour, the wind was not boding well. It was on their noses, and the riders were in no hurry to start the race. As with every international classic too, everybody is in high spirits. The thought of cycle racing doesn't really appeal, but the finish does, and that is still to come. Darren Smith was still in second place, and there was a smile on the face of Thomas Lisa. And Jeff Stewart, always one for a joke, always likes to keep Robert Crow's energy up. This had been a great race for Robert Crow. He too could be expected to be named on the Olympic squad for next year. But at the back of the field, when the race was riding along neutralised, a touch of handlebars with Mike Landsman, and one rider on the floor. Ettore Bardolato had broken his collarbone and was out of the Classic with only 140 kilometres to go. Bardolato had fallen with Glenn Price and Peter Attard, but happily those two had not been seriously injured and were now in the field. Although the green flag had long since been pulled in and the race was underway, there was no change in speed. They were hardly managing 30 kilometres an hour for quite a while. The headwind was too much. Still, the race speed overall had been a very fast 43 kilometres an hour. The first wheels in anger were being turned at Waterfall after 15 kilometres. Alexander Nadobenko getting the better of Jan Koort, surprisingly there, and Bob Rasenberg, the winner at the Rocks, was in third place. Now there were 2 hills before the long descent off Mount Ousley down into Wollongong, and the riders could no longer stay at a slow pace. There was points to be won in the King of the Mountains. Sergei Smievskoy started the last climb just 1 point away from the lead off Jan Koorts. Smievskoy won the first climb, and Jan Koorts wasn't in the top 5. So the man in the orange jersey had to now only confirm himself as the winner of the King of the Mountains. The second King of the Mountains climb at 47 kilometres, Smievskoy again winning, Thomas Lisa taking second place, and again Jan Koort wasn't in the top 5. So Jan Koort would lose his lead in the King of the Mountains, and that would pass over to the Soviet Sergei Smievskoy. The headwind also spoiled the long descent down into Wollongong. It virtually kept the riders all together. The long descent down the hills, and on the far side of the picture there, you can see the finishing line. That's if your eyesight is good, because that is Flagstaff Hill, down at basement level. And the riders thinking now of the 10 finishing circuits down there, and the wind that was whipping in off the sea. One man who knew it all was Jonathan Hall. He lives in the city of Wollongong, and he was anxious now to bring the Commonwealth Bank Classic to his hometown in first place. Lisa was surviving another day with great credibility. He was still near the front of the pack. The only man he had to watch was Darren Smith. The race was now on to the finishing circuit. The sea itself told the story. This was to be a very tough finish, and indeed it was to bring yet another surprise to the overall situation. Patrick Jonker, so disappointed having lost his early lead in this race and then fell away from the overall leaderboard, had won 2 stages already. He was now out on the attack again, but this time he was being shadowed by the most important Bosch rider, Alex Kastenhuber. Kastenhuber was in 6th place overall, and by the time the 2 riders sprinted out the finish 10 laps onto the circuit, Kastenhuber had climbed up to 3rd place overall. The stage window went to Patrick Jonker, his 3rd of this race, and only 2 other Australians have ever won 3 in the same classic.
Thank you, David.
And they were Glenn Clark in 1983 and Barney St. George. Thomas Lisa not only had held his overall lead, he'd now seen his teammate climb up to 3rd place overall. Who would want to be Darren Smith for the start of the last race? He was caught in a Bosch sandwich. And so it is back by road to Darling Harbour and into the shadow of the new Novotel at the harbour side. And now was the most interesting circuit race to take this race to its close. Thomas Lisa knew now that barring an accident, this race was his. He was now hoping that this race too would give him a victory that would eventually guide him to a place on the Barcelona Olympic team for Germany. Around the face of the conference centre at Darling Harbour, the riders again started fast, and the tactics were quite simple: keep the pace high and stop the attacks off the front. Darren Smith was developing well. The state champion from Queensland was now riding at the head of the field. He was finishing this race a tower of strength. It was a marvellous crowd, and you could see it on television right throughout its entirety. There was no hiding on this circuit, as the riders found out. The New Zealand riders who'd started so well were not finishing quite so well. Rick Reed had lost his second place overall with a few days to go. So it was back to the British champion, John Hughes, attacking just like he did at Foster, about 1.5 laps from the finish. And again the field hesitated. You'd have thought by now they would have learned about the crafty Liverpudlians' tricks as they come towards the finish. John Hughes is a very strong rider, and once clear that a few men can catch him. As the field come out of the far end, watch at the back of the field. You might see a bike fly through the air. And if you do, well, that was the bike of Steve Calland, who hit the barriers, along with another Australian rider, Peter Barnett. Calland was not too seriously injured, and Barnett happened to get up so fast we never even saw him, while John Hughes at the front made it 2 stage wins for the British champion, and he'll be back for more next year. But there was no doubt who'd won this race. He'd led it from the city of Grafton. He'd held off too many shock surprises, the biggest of them all coming from Darren Smith. The whole team were delighted. Bosch, who supported this race for so many years, at last had found a man who could win it for them. And just about everybody in the race took time out to say well done to a man who used to be an Olympic champion on the track. Thomas Lisa can now look forward to going home to Germany and hopefully a place on the road squad. He said goodbye to track cycling because Germany now has simply too many fast track riders. He hopes and hopes he can make the road team for the Olympic Games next year. This had been a marvellous classic, and it had found a truly great winner. And the Soviet team that started slowly came back strongly. Sergei Smievsky winning the Australian Telecom King of the Mountains competition. And the best sprinter too. The Commonwealth Bank rollover champion was Jan Koorts. He chose to ride this race the hard way. He'd led in every competition and actually won 2 of them. The Pacific Power points jersey pulled on over the Commonwealth Bank pink jersey. And the Soviet Polaroid team, well, a late burst from them made sure they ran out the winners of the Caltex Team Championship. Their award was these beautiful pieces of Bohemia crystal. So the Soviets had come, and again they had conquered part of what had been an excellent Commonwealth Bank Classic. And thanks to Qantas, the riders are now on the way home. Goodbye.